welcome to Ecclesiastes. We're in chapter 2, but we're going to do a brief recap of chapter 1. So we have the book introduction. We talked about, hey, could be Solomon as the author, could be somebody writing in the guise of Solomon. And then we rolled right into the thesis for this first section here. What is the gain? And so Kohelet introduces this idea of, hey, I'm looking for the profit. What do all these things profit mankind? And he starts off by really looking at the idea of toil. And we had the Cycles poem where we dove in and said, okay, what are all of these things that we see in nature? What are these things that we experience in human life? And he sort of came to the conclusion, all right, well, at the end of the day, it doesn't seem like effort does us any good, right? We'll talk about that in a second. So then he ended the section with this sort of reflective speech. And so now, our effort is ultimately a hopeless chase. And he said our best wisdom still results in pain and frustration and doesn't allow us the control that we desire. And so we start off again with that sort of theme. Life is hevel. There seems to be no lasting impact. It's certainly true that, and we're going to see this again and again throughout the book of Ecclesiastes, that, so this is Old Testament, right? So we are thinking about a different dispensation. They have they don't have as full of a picture as we have as New Testament believers, but they do still have, they still have their faith in God. They still have the hope of things yet to come. And we're going to see that Kohelet does bring up this hope, and he's going to allude to especially the judgment that will come after the grave. And of course, he looks toward godly wisdom and the knowledge of that future judgment as compelling factors for how then should we live. But what he doesn't say is he says, okay, everything's going to be fine because one day we're going to be resurrected. Instead, he sort of has us dwelling in the heaviness and saying, okay, how do we face this head on and deal with it sort of a little bit more practically? And he's sort of looking at it a little bit more from the, okay, but there's real pain and there's real sorrow, and how do we lean into this tension that I feel without just sort of saying, okay, yeah, but there's this future one day. He does allude to it, and he does point to that. So hold on to the tension as we're going through the book. Now, we are going to do a very brief checkpoint because we have, like I said, a lot to do today. So turn to the person next to you / around you. Think about what stood out from last week. If you were here from last week, what stood out from the lesson? And then think about this question. And if you just want to answer the second one, that's fine. So this section focused on the frustration of perceiving no lasting impact and the inability of wisdom to answer life's questions. Which of these feels more relevant to you today? I'm going to give you literally 2 to 3 minutes. Turn to the person next to you. Go ahead and share. Go. So, what you see displayed up on the screen are some pictures, some snapshots from my wedding day, and it was a wonderful experience, and I'll tell you, it felt long in coming, but I had acknowledged for many years that, it wasn't a guarantee, and so I determined ahead of time, you know what, I'm excited for this day, I'm going to be super present, and I took joy in every single little thing, right? So the flowers, the dress, the music, the lights, the food, all like the wall hangings, the people, and you know what, I was just so thankful. I was like, I'm so jazzed to be here, man. Like I was so excited. And yet, when we swung back around to church after taking our portraits, it was all gone, right? So, literally, it was like 2 hours later, we came back and we're like, it's all gone. It's all gone. All the decorations were taken down. The food was either eaten or packed away somewhere. The music, well, there was no music playing, and the people had dispersed off to, back to their homes, and the wedding was over. And so if we had been counting on that wedding vibe to continue throughout the course of our marriage, you can bet your bottom dollar that we would be doomed for marital disaster, right? But that's at least part of what we're going to talk about today. So Kohelet is going to examine what good our efforts can turn out. And we've already sort of talked about wisdom and toil. We're going to return to those, but we're also going to talk about pleasure and how, does it really give us that lasting gain? And we're going to examine what we ought to do in the face of the heaviness of human effort. We're going to do a brief overview of the structure of chapter 2 now. We're going to, at the end, sort of pull it all together because this is the second half of the first section. So chapter 1, we covered sort of the first half. This is the second half. So chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, we're going to look at pleasure. And then 12 through 17, we're going to see the theme of wisdom reappearing. And then 18 through 23, toil. The theme of toil is going to reappear. And then we're going to end this section with our first enjoy life refrain. And if you remember from week 1, we talked about there are 7 enjoy life refrains throughout the book of Ecclesiastes. And so this is the first one that he gives us to say, okay, so that this is the big picture. Buckle in. Here we go. Let's read the verses. So, chapter 2, verse 1. I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this also was Hebel. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? Now, the phrase, I said in my heart, begins the subsection. Note that this phrase was also used in 1:16. So we see this repetition of this phrase, I said in my heart. Now, this is just a fancy way of describing talking to yourself. Honestly, I can't judge, first of all, because I frequently find myself muttering and mumbling and blithering away, and I'm like, blah, blah, blah. And secondly, you guys have heard the phrase, right? Okay, well, I only talk to myself because I'm the smartest person in the room. Now, I don't claim that, but Kohelet did. So he's like, I'm talking to the smartest person in the room here. So now what is Kohelet seeking to do? He's seeking to tell his audience, all right, we're turning and we're examining pleasure. Now, what's interesting about the word pleasure is that it's actually that word simha, which is, if you remember, is one of our key words that we're looking at. It's the word for joy. And so keep this in mind, that pleasure is not a bad word. It's not a bad thing. I think that we can oftentimes think about the word pleasure and we think about, the sinful indulgences of the flesh. But that's not necessarily what Kohelet is examining here. There's many good things in life that we can rejoice in, that we can enjoy. Now, part of the reason that we understand that the pleasure that he's talking about isn't bad is, first of all, he uses the word pleasure in good ways throughout the book. But also, what's going to come next is a series of activities that he pursued that caused his heart to rejoice, and he examines what happens after those feelings fade. And what the list that he describes, we're going to see, aren't sinful things. They're just, some stuff. So what we're going to see in this section is that chasing pleasure for pleasure's sake isn't satisfactory. It doesn't give us that lasting satisfaction, and instead leaves us empty. And so once more, Kohelet lets us know his conclusions up front. It's not, sometimes we read stuff and like, what are we saying? No, he's going to let us know right up front, pursuit of pleasure is Hebel. And once again, we're seeing this idea of that there's no lasting impact, that it's insubstantial. It's not something that you can count on, lean into, and sort of take with you. It's that pleasure is this thing that's here and it's gone, and you're like, okay, well, that was great, but now the wedding decorations are taken down, all right? It's like a soap bubble that sparkles in the sunlight and then poof, it's gone. Now, interestingly, so verse 2, I think that the better, now again, not me, but the people who are smart translators and have thought of all the different ways that things can come across, I think a better way to understand the verse is, I said of laughter, what does it boast? And of pleasure, what does this accomplish? And that's that's a translation that makes more sense of the Hebrew, and I think leads into the section better. So it's presenting the questions, okay, invites us in again with him. What does it accomplish? Let's examine it together. And of course, the implied answer is that they're insubstantial, fleeting, and of no lasting impact. Now, again, this sort of throws me off because I'm used to being entertained, and whenever we're entertained, we like suspense a little bit. It doesn't even need to be that scary. Suspense, it can, if I was to write and then narrate a recipe blog, I'd start off and say, all right, guys, so I decided to try this new soup recipe. But it wasn't from my recipe book or from, something my mom handed me. No, it just sort of popped up while I was scrolling on Facebook Marketplace. But I was like, I don't know if I can trust these guys. I don't know, but I read the list of ingredients and, And so first of all, nobody cares, right? Because we all skip the recipe plugs and we go, I'm like, I just want the recipe. But in any circumstance, like we're used to sort of that informal tension in stories that sort of keeps us entertained, and then we wait for the punchline at the end. Think of any movie you go to. They don't just tell you the whole story right up front in the first 2 minutes. No, they sort of leave you in suspense. Kohelet's not doing that. He tells us right up front, this is what I found. Okay, now let's look at it together. Now, importantly, he is taking us on a journey, and the journey is important. And because his journey often can match ours, he's saying, okay, I'm going in with wisdom, and our journeys, sometimes we don't take wisdom with us, so it's an important journey to go on together. Let's look at verses 3 and 4. I search with my heart how to cheer my body with wine. My heart still guided me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the children of man to do under heaven during the few days of their life. I made great works. Now, in verse 3, Kohelet uses another tactic that I use in my argumentation writing classes, and he anticipates the potential counter-arguments. He says, hey, you know what? My audience out there, you probably think that I'm just going to dive wholeheartedly into pleasure, and that I'm just actually doing it so that I can feel good and, just have a good time. Just sort of rabble-rousing here. I've fallen away from God. I'm acting like a fool. And what he says up front is, nope, I actually went into this with my wits about me. And he maintains, you're going to see throughout this section, he says it multiple times, that he has set out on a rational, logical, not hedonistic experiment. And what he's looking to do is to see if pleasure can satisfactorily answer the problems of life. Does it give us that lasting gain? This happens in our day too. So one example that I took a look at was, I don't know why. So there's this fast food experiment. This hospital was like, hey, I want to see why people develop diseases like diabetes and hypertension, but some people don't. So they legitimately recruited people to gain weight, eating just fast food. It's just disgusting. I was like, I was reading this article. And so they picked fast food specifically because they could measure the fat and calorie count so specifically. And so, I kid you not, all of these people ate a whole bunch of McBurgers or whatever and gained a whole bunch of weight, all in the name of science. It was in the name of science. And if you read some of the things, you see the people like saying, yeah, the first couple of weeks were kind of fun, but then it was like, this is awful. This is really terrible, man. Like it was not fun. But so it is possible for us to sort of indulge in something with this sort of abstracted mindset. And what we see in these first couple of verses here is sort of that laying hold on folly. We see these frivolous activities, thinking about all the harmless but enjoyable forms, things that we can enjoy in life. And this pairs well with the idea of wine. So it just sort of makes you feel good for a little bit and then it's gone. It's not saying here that he got drunk, but it's just, hey, I had some wine, I enjoyed wine, and how do I use it to make me feel good? Something that you might put on this list, maybe getting your nails done. I don't know. It's not a total waste, right? But unless they seal your foot in concrete, that's not lasting more than a couple of weeks, and then it's gone. Another activity might be, for me, like playing a computer game like Nancy Drew, solving all the puzzles, right? Do I have anything to show for it once I finished all the puzzles I completed the game? No, but I feel good. I think that can be a similar comparison for what he's describing here. Now, take note of one of our key words that's mentioned here, tov. So one of his goals for the book is to show his audience how to navigate this journey skillfully, and this is one aspect thereof. This is what is good to undertake, all right? And now, the final phrase, I made great works, is really a transition word. It's moving away from all of the frivolous activities, and he's moving toward other stuff. A different translation of this phrase could be something like, I expanded my sphere of activity. So I said, okay, I was looking at just frivolous stuff, and now I'm going to expand my experimentation to other things. And I don't know, you may also translate it to, I just picked up some new hobbies. Because if you look down the list, you're going to see that it almost sounds like, hey, these are all of these hobbies that I picked up. So keep a note of that. We're going to take a look at his list here. And I couldn't fit it on, so I was just like, it doesn't matter. We just have to go over it. It's fine. All right, starting in verse 4. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted in them all sorts of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I also had great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I got singers, both men and women, and many concubines, the delights of the sons of men. Now, as we think about the nature of these activities, some people will say, hey, this list kind of matches up with, as we talked about in the beginning, King Solomon. We know from scripture that he was fabulously wealthy and in fact did have, all these slaves. He did building projects and he was, he had lots of women, right? Lots and lots and lots of women. We understand as well, though, that Solomon was led astray by these wives into idolatry. And Solomon definitely fell away from worshiping the one true God. However, we don't get that impression from these verses. What we're getting from these verses is, hey, it's dispassionate, he's impartial, he's reflecting, hey, I'm a scientist reporting the results of an experiment. Hey, I wasn't quite sure, I didn't have my Google with me, so I substituted 3 tablespoons of garlic powder for 3 cloves of garlic. Turns out that rate of exchange is incorrect and I can still taste the garlic, right? So it's just sort of like relating the results of an experiment. So does it match up with Solomon? Possibly. The other thing to note is that the list of things that Solomon includes, with the exception of like the concubines, remember that in this time period, having slaves wasn't necessarily the same thing as whenever we think of slaves in the South, or the all of that terrible stuff that was happening. That it wasn't like, we look at it now and we're like, oh no, you shouldn't own slaves, but it wasn't bad like it is today. Concubines, we look at it and be like, no. But that these aren't necessarily like bad things. Like, is it bad to plant vineyards for yourself? Is it bad to have amassed silver and gold, to have singers? No, not necessarily. And so this list of stuff, you can think about like gardening is something that you put time and effort into, and you create these things, or you do home improvement projects, and you're like, look, I transformed my kitchen, and now my kitchen is really cool. I have made the best meal possible. Look at this spread, So this isn't necessarily a list of wicked activities, but it is a list of activities which brings about pleasure. And again, with the possible exception of concubines, we're going to actually come back to that in just a second. Now, highlighting here comes it really in handy, and it allows you to see the parallelism in theme that Kohelet uses in these verses. Each of these activities comes in couplets. The only single line that doesn't have a real corollary is verse 8. So I got singers, both men and women, and concubines. So I highlighted them because, I was like, well, they have to be it seems like naturally there would be a pair, and I'm going to explain why I highlighted them in a second. But if you just read them in English, those seem like very, very, very different things. Singers and concubines, right? And so it turns out that the Hebrew behind this last line is like desperately terrible. It's really, really weird. So the phrase "the delights of the sons of men," which is the second phrase, is more literally the delights of human offspring. So the delights of human offspring, and there isn't a sexual connotation. Everywhere else in the Bible, like in Proverbs 19:10, which says, "It is not fitting for a fool to live in luxury," it's the same phrase, "much less for a slave to rule over princes." The phrase refers to things, not people. Now, the final phrase, which is slipped into English, so concubines, is found nowhere else in the Old Testament. So that phrase is just, they don't know. Now, it shares roots up there with the word breast. So they were like, you know what? It's got to be concubine. So they just sort of went, and then they just sort of threw it up on the screen. Now, again, if you're reading Solomon into this, then that translation, you're like, okay, I can sort of make that work. But I find that connection tenuous and the resulting translation dissatisfactory. So in context, given the ambiguity of the Hebrew, the fact that nothing else in the subsection really indicates questionable moral nature, and the context of the previous line, I favor the translation musical instruments, which if you look at some other translations, they do end up using musical instruments. Now you can disagree with me, but that's an interesting thing. I'm like, oh, parallelism helped me out. Fun stuff. Nice. One final observation on this section. It's all about Kohelet, right? So again, we see that this reflection of, hey, I'm doing this dive for myself. It's not like I'm building works for the kingdom. I'm not building it for God. Remember, Solomon built what? What great work did he build? The temple, right? So he built the temple, and he built all this stuff for the kingdom. And again, you can sort of parse lines over, okay, well, what's the thing? But this very definitively is I went about this with a goal in mind so that I could see what gain did these pleasures give to me. Again, this isn't a hill that I'm going to die on but I'm not sure it's on. Anyway, let's keep reading. Verse 9. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me, and whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was the reward for all my toil. And so you can sort of summarize this by saying, I did all the things, literally all of them. And I have the asterisk there because he's again telling us, I did it with my brain on. I didn't just sort of dive in and, get super drunk and, just sort of waste myself upon these things. No, I did this as an experiment. And the emphasis, it's really interesting. There seems to be a little bit of an emphasis here on effort, that it wasn't just something that he enjoyed, but it was something that he acquired, that he gained, that he constructed, which is just interesting. It's an interesting perspective here. And we see this word reward show up, and this is another of our key words, helik. This is the lot. This is what God gives to the person who does effort and gets this back. Continuing forward. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it. And behold, all was hevel, and a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. And so, this is sort of the conclusion verse for the first section in chapter 2. He has these awesome transition words, then and behold, it lets us know, hey, we're coming to the end of the section. We also see him saying, hey, so this is hevel, and I would say this is, insubstantial is a good way to sort of think about the translation for hevel here. He also talks about, the striving after wind. You can't grasp it. You can't hold on to the results of pleasure. So pleasure's here for that moment, and then it's gone. And of course, we have him saying that there is no gain. There's no lasting gain. There's no yitron, and keeping that perspective, that it's no gain under the sun. So what I forgot to bring in was my wedding bouquet. So I made my wedding bouquet. It was a mistake, but anyway, so they were not, because they're not real flowers. So to get the bouquet, what I had to do, I first stared at the computer screen for hours, deciding which flowers to select and which colors, because they're made of wood. So you get to pick them, and then they dye them and whatever. So they finally ordered them, and then made a concoction, which we had to wait for this concoction to cool down, and then we had to dip all the wood flowers in them so that we would soften the wood, right? And after that, we then had to attach the flowers to the stems, which
that noise was appropriate.
Yes. So this involved a fair amount of trial and error, lots of stabbing, and then the hot glue gun. So I will let you know that me and tools don't get along, and so it was an event. Now, once a large quantity of flowers had been stemmed, I then had to arrange them. So this was a nightmare of baby's breath and dried lavender and color layouts that lasted multiple hours, spanning at least 3 separate days. I really don't even want to talk about it. It was like, I remember standing, my arms cramping, you know, because I'm like holding and I'm like trying to, and because, you know, like they have those things that you can, but I was like, it didn't work for whatever, I'm like, it's not working, and so I'm holding it, and I'm like, and then like one of them like slipped out, and so then I had to redo it, and I was like, oh my gosh! So then we finally got it in place, and then like the twine that I used to secure it all in place, that was relatively simple in comparison. But again, super glue. So my fingers were really not happy with me as I'm like gluing my hand to the twine. It's fine. So by the time I got the finishing lace to wrap around, my soul was dead, and I was regretting all of my life choices. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's just flowers. Who cares? Who cares? Nobody cares. It doesn't matter. And so that was the result. There was reward for my toil, right? I had this really pretty bouquet and I have these pictures, and that's great. But was there any lasting gain? No.
Did you get to keep the bouquet?
Oh yes, no, I was going to bring it in, but I forgot. Like I just forgot. If I can get it to come back up, I'll show it again. So Kohelet concludes, any attempt to find a rationale for existence in pleasure and affluence is bound to fail, even if that effort is sobered by self-control. And so the payoff doesn't match the effort that's expended. And so that's sort of what's going on here. Now notice here that this is going to be the center of the argument. We're going to see at the end that this is sort of like a chiastic structure, and that points to pleasure, and so the failure of pleasure to succeed. All right, so that was the first half where we got 30 minutes in. Let's keep rolling. We roll. All right, verse 12. So I turned to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can a man do who comes after the king? Only what has already been done. Then I saw that there is more gain in wisdom than in folly, as there is more gain in light than in darkness. The wise person has eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. Now we're back to wisdom, right? As we're thinking about highlighting, it's easy to sort of see, there's the change of theme. Of course, he uses, again, a beautiful transition phrase, so I turned, very helpful for us. Some of the transitions in the book are not going to be so easy to see, and that then the highlighting comes more in handy, but we can see that there's this repetition of theme here. And so keep in mind that he's still answering the question from chapter 1, verse 3, what is the gain? So again, we're going back to wisdom. How does exerting effort and figuring out and applying wisdom to my life benefit me in the long run? And so the first verse here, the second lines, again, don't really do much for us. What can the man do who comes after the king? Only what has already been done. You're like, what in the world are we talking about? And so we ask, who is the one who comes after the king? And why does the king leave? So as we discussed, when do kings leave? When they're dead, right? So who comes after the king? The next king, yeah, so the successor. So one ruler succeeds another, and what is there to do except, well, what's sort of already been done. And so anybody who's interested even a little bit in politics can resonate with this, right? So for the past 3 years and 364 days, we've been in, the 2024 election season. And so we've been hearing politicians making grand promises of these sweeping changes, right? And starting January 20th, I don't make predictions, right? But someone will stand in the White House and affirm they're going to make a difference. Mm-hmm. But no matter who takes office, what do they really, really effectively do? Right? And so they pass some tax reform or not, they fire some people or not, get rid of some regulations or add some new ones, and what's accomplished? What's the good of the prior guy's wisdom? What's the good of the new guy's wisdom? Just sort of keeps on rolling. The next guy's going to accomplish the same sort of things the prior guy did, so what's the lasting impact? So, a depressing start, but what we're going to see here is that Kohelet asks, so what's the gain in wisdom? But he's also going to pull in this idea of better than reasoning. So he's now holding things in tension. So he's saying, look, I don't see the lasting gain, and yet I'm going to tell you that there's something that is better. There's something that is tov, that is good about wisdom, that makes it better for you than if you just sort of go about as a fool. And he uses this analogy about darkness. Now, Tlaxcaltepec, now I don't really remember if that's the correct way to say it, but whenever we went to Mexico, one of the times on a youth group mission trip, we had this caving expedition. And it was fun, sort of, not really. I don't know why I agreed to go, because I'm claustrophobic, right? So this is just like a terrible experience. So this is what we did, right? So we went into this cave, we had the headlights, we had the helmets and everything. And some of it was sort of fun until we got to like, what is it called, the birth canal? Is that what they called it? And it was this optional section. So I don't know why I did it, because I'm claustrophobic. So it was so narrow that first of all, if you turned your helmet, like there would be sections that you couldn't get through because you had to keep your helmet the correct way. You also had to go in on the correct side. So if you went in on your left side, you wouldn't make it through because it looped. And so you had to be able to turn your butt. So you had to make sure you were going in oriented the correct direction so you can make the turns in this birth canal thing. I know, it's awful, right? So that's not even the point of the story. I just felt like I had to share about the birth canal. So we get to the back of the cave, right? We get to the back of the cave, and they're like, okay, everybody, turn your lights off. Now, anybody who's been out in the dark, or like some night hike or something, you turn the lights off, and then after a couple minutes, what happens? Yeah, your eyes adjust, and you can see, because there's all of this light that's sort of filtering down through the trees or whatever. In the cave, you turn the lights off, and what happens?
It's dark.
Nothing. Awful.
That's go out.
What happens is your brain starts to make up stuff. And it starts to put, like whenever you stare at a bright light for like a second, or if like the sun, you accidentally look at the sun and you get like this sort of those after images, your brain starts to make up like you, and you're like, oh my, there's nothing there. and it's so dark that your brain literally can't make sense of it and starts making stuff up. And so if you were to walk around, not only would you bump into stuff, but you would actually like be responding to things that aren't there. And I think that's such a great analogy for how the fool goes about life. They're not paying attention to wisdom. They're making life choices that you're like, oh my gosh, that was so avoidable. And yet they don't see it. They're reacting to things that aren't there, and that is the foolish path. There's this website called the Darwin Awards. And so it's like Charles Darwin, evolution of the species. People select themselves out of the gene pool by doing really stupid stuff. And this site is simply full. It's full of stories. I'm not gonna read all of them because I would just stay here all day. But there's full of stories of people doing just the silliest things, living with 23 venomous snakes, jumping off of a cliff, driving their car over this drawbridge that was not down, it was up. They're like, we can make it, and launching out into the air. And you're like, you're a fool. You're a fool. And so there is advantage. There is great advantage in wisdom. And so Kohelet is saying, hey, wisdom's better for you, okay? Verse 14 continued, and yet I perceived that the same event happens to all of them. Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart that this also is Hebel. For of the wise, as of the fool, there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that in the days to come all will have been long forgotten. How the wise dies, just like the fool. So I hated life, because what is done under the sun was grievous to me, for all is Hebel and is striving after wind. We have this introduction of death as the great leveler. And this makes Kohelet really upset. He's looking at it and he's saying, look, if I live, and we're going to see this repeated over and over throughout Ecclesiastes, that in the face of death, Kohelet is going to question what is the benefit. And here again, we're talking about wisdom. What's the benefit of guarding each step with wisdom if death is going to come anyway? And to a point, is he wrong? No. Death is inevitable. And sometimes it doesn't matter what you do. And this was one of, I think, the things that was hard to see going through the period of COVID, where there was some things that you could do that would definitely help to minimize your chances of encountering the virus. But I remember hearing many stories of people like this one woman from Charlotte, North Carolina, and she did everything right. So she wore the mask, she used gloves whenever she was handling, getting the mail, whenever she was bringing groceries in. She didn't make contact with almost anyone, and she still got sick. And we know, and there are other people who got sick and died, and they were following what they thought was wisdom, and yet death is still inevitable. And so she expressed frustration, and like many other people. And so what's the good of all the wisdom if it doesn't actually prevent it? And so we see Kohelet concluding, hey, there is no yitron, no lasting gain. And I just sort of did all my slides because there we go. He also returns to the theme of legacy. And he's, as we talked about last week, death destroys both the wise sayings that have been accumulated, also all the actual wisdom that's been accumulated, and if you think about it, some of the results of wisdom. So if you've been living wisely, so you preserved your life, but eventually death's going to come to you too. And so Kohelet essentially concludes, bah humbug. He's saying he's very discouraged. He's expressing the frustration about this. And he says, I hated life because of what it's done, and the son was grievous to me. It hurt my heart. I looked down, he's just like, this is just not right. Verse 18, so I hated all of my toil in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to the man who will come after me, and who knows whether he will be wise or a fool. So yet he will be master of all, for which I toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This also is Hebel. So I turned about and gave my heart up to despair over all of the toil of my labors under the sun. Because sometimes a person who toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil for it. This also is Hebel and a great evil. Now this is, again, a new section. We've returned to the theme of toil. So we see again this repetition of these themes here. And a brief note, the phrase to be enjoyed or to be enjoyed by is actually not in it doesn't seem to be in the original Hebrew, so I just crossed it out. So like that, there you go. As we return to this section, we have this theme reintroduced, but again with the theme of death incorporated. So wisdom returned with the idea of death, and now wisdom is returning with the reverse. Wisdom returned with death, toil is returning with the theme of death in it as well. So what is the gain that toil brings to the worker after the worker has died? And what he's going to conclude again is, hey, there's this, he is expending, I'm like, expend. Yeah, he's expending effort for nothing. So the first situation that he has is that the person who comes after you might squander it. So you never know. So like if you think about, your kids, and you hope that, whenever they get your stuff, that they're not going to just, do what?
Squander.
Yeah, get the dumpster out back, right? We've heard people in this church, I'm not going to mention names, but say, all right, when the hearse goes up in the front, pull up the dumpster in the rear, right? You're like, oh my gosh, it's awful, but you could just throw it away. You've heard of people who were these great tycoons who die, and then their son takes over the company or whatever, and then the 2 years later that the company's in the ditch because they squandered the inheritance that was given to them. Now, the next sort of section, he talks about, hey, the person who comes after me, doesn't matter whether they're wise or not, they didn't work for it. They didn't work for it. I did the work. It was me. And they're benefiting from what I worked. Now, of course, we would look and say, well, we want to benefit our children, but Kohelet is looking at, hey, what is the benefit to the person who works? What benefit directly does it afford them? And he's like, well, it goes to somebody else. The results are going to eventually pass to somebody else. And later he's going to talk about sometimes I don't even get to enjoy the labors of the fruit of my labor in this life. And that's frustrating. Again, this is something that he says this is awful. He talks about hate, despair. He says this is frustrating. What the heck? Now, interestingly, we see again these phrases evil and then the phrase under the sun. Remember that he is looking at things from a limited horizontal perspective. We are going to see in just a couple verses, we're going to see the perspective flip a little bit. But what he's showing us here is, hey, as we navigate life, this is what I see. This is evil under the sun. This seems to be rather wretched. This is probably also a translation of Hebel that includes the idea of foulness. This is repulsive. And so Kohelet concludes, 22 and 23, what has a man from all the toil and striving of heart with which he toils beneath the sun? For all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is a vexation. Even in the night his heart does not rest. This also is Hebel. And again, so he's asking the question, what does this even really profit you today? There's all sorts of videos out there of the Gen Z generation complaining that they can't keep up even with working, 40 hours a week. They're like, I can't do it. What's interesting is, so this one podcaster named Kira Davis points out that this has actually been true for like all of history. Like one person working on their own 40 hours a week, no, that doesn't cut it. You have to work. Like throughout history, we've been like barely surviving, and it's only been within the last like 100 years that we've started to be like, oh, I can breathe. Like I have free time. Like that's a new thing. That's a new thing. And like unless you were the richest of rich, it's a you're surviving day to day. No, subsistence. Thank you. I was like, oh gosh. And the other thing about it is, so anxiety about survival can definitely keep you up at night, right? So like even if you're actually sort of getting through, and you're not scrambling to survive, whether we work outside the home, whether we volunteer, work inside the home, or some combination thereof, I'm sure all of us have experienced at least one night where some task or person has just been weighing on our minds, and we're just sort of lying there in bed going, and then we don't sleep. Doesn't give us any rest. And so we've run the gambit of toil, wisdom, and pleasure, examining each in turn. And for each, Kohelet says, hey, there's good things about them, but there's no lasting gain. However, at the end of this last big section, we're going to encounter our first enjoy life refrain. We're going to go just a little bit long today. Verse 24, there's nothing better for a person that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? For to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. But to the sinner, he has given the business of gathering and collecting, only to give to the one who pleases God. This also is Hebel and is striving after wind. And so this is, again, our first enjoy life refrain. And what he's concluding here is this is what is better. This is the good thing that God has given to us to enjoy. So in the face of the Hebelness of life, what's better? To enjoy the labors and the pleasure that God does bestow upon us. We can think about in the New Testament things like James chapter 1 verse 17, which talks about how every good gift and every perfect gift is from where? It's from above. It's from our Father in heaven, who delights to give good gifts to his children. That's a theme that we see also in the New Testament. And so good things come from the hand of God. The ability to enjoy good comes from the hand of God. And living wisely and working hard makes you more likely to receive those good things. And so when they come, enjoy them. And so this last verse here, we look at what is Hebel, because it comes right after verse 26, and it seems kind of weird. So to answer this question, let's look at the structure of the whole section. So we have the book introduction, and then we see this sort of chiastic structure. What is the gain? Toil, Hebel. Wisdom, Hebel, especially in the face of death. And we look at pleasure right there in the middle as the turning point. And we see the enjoy life refrain at the very end. And so as we think about the turn, there's many ways to interpret verse 26, but what it seems to be is that toil, wisdom, and pleasure are unworthy goals in and of themselves. That's the gathering and collecting, the business that the sinner undertakes, pursuing the work of our hands, the accomplishments of a wisely lived life, and the enjoyments of pleasure, that in and of themselves, those in and of themselves are worthless pursuits. You won't be able to achieve the results you want, and whatever you do achieve will puff away like mist. And so he says, hey, acknowledge their shortfalls, and yet dwell in the goodness of God, thank him for his good gifts, and live in the midst of this moment. Jeff quoted a commentary whenever he taught the class, and I remembered it, so I found it again whenever I was going through. I was like, oh, great. So there is nothing noble about rejecting the good gifts that God seeks to give, nor is there anything attractive about a religious faith represented by a tired and joyless people. And so lean into the goodness of God and the gifts that he gives us. And we're going to address some of those other aspects as well as we continue to go through. Hey, hike your own hike if you so desire. There's the checkpoint to hit the trail for chapter 2. Looking forward to next week, chapter 3, the map out section. I'll send an email out with lots of information because we're over time. Thank you guys so much. Go eat breakfast. Have a great day. Only 4 minutes over. Oh, I was looking at the list.
Hey, you're still ahead of Pappy, so you're good.
That's right. That's right. He's still going.